You know, I take a very keen interest and a hard line on Republicans. And you seem to have had almost a conversion. And I want to ask you the role that your wife played in telling you have to stop this, in not just privately doing the right thing, but in being so public and vocal about what the wrong thing is and who's doing it in your view. How did that happen?
Nicole, if there's one thing that I could tell the country and today, it would be that the effort to overturn the 2020 presidential election was not and is not politics. This is, as we now know from the indictments of the former president by the Department of Justice and Jack Smith, these were grave crimes against the United States of America, perhaps almost as grave as would have been treason. The night that I received the first call from my longtime friend Richard Cullen, he cast the question that way, which is, what can we do for the country? What can the Vice President of the United States do for America 2 days thence? This has never been a mission of mine. It's never been a quest of mine, as the Washington Post said. It's I suppose one could say that it's been a quest, only in the limited sense that it has been a search, not just on my part, but on the part of the American people for the truth under the Constitution of the United States about the events of January 6th. Just one word about your impending question about my conservative transition. Again, this is not political, Nicole. It never has been, and it never will be. I've not changed my conservative jurisprudential views. I've not changed my conservative political views one bit in 50 years.
I was not going to ask you about your conversion. It's abundantly clear that the Republican Party, in terms of numbers, is moving or turning into one of the largest autocratic, curious, autocratic-friendly movements in the world. It's clear that it changed. And I wonder if you ever wonder why more people like yourself aren't screaming and warning as loudly as you are.
And Nicole, I've said recently that, in my view, in the way that I define an American political party, and incidentally, that's the way that Americans have defined political parties since our founding, today there is no Republican Party. As to your question as to the fact that very, very few of our public officials and very, very few of Republicans in general have spoken a single word against January 6th and the former president's role in that, that is mystifying. And it's, in my view, a testament to how lost the Republican Party is at this point in our history.
Is it, in its current configuration, with its silence, a threat?
Nicole, American democracy cannot function unless there are two robust, healthy political parties. Today, we do not have two healthy, robust, functioning political parties. And so for that reason alone, American democracy is in peril. As I've said repeatedly over the past year and in many fora, the two political parties are the political guardians of American democracy.
There are two parties. There are only thinking of the fact that there were only two members willing to participate in an effort to get to the bottom of what happened on January 6th and that nearly unprecedented attack on the U.S. Capitol, and both of them lost their jobs for doing so. Do you feel more alarmed today than you did on the day that you testified?
Heroism often comes about when one or several people have the courage and the will and the moral conviction to speak against what is wrong. That's what happened with Congressman Liz Cheney and Congressman Adam Kinzinger. And they are to be applauded, indeed honored, for speaking the truth, if you will, to the American people, pursuant to their oath to the Constitution.
I want to ask you about the rule of law, and I want to ask you if the rule of law is, in your view, strong enough to take Donald Trump running against it. He's not really running against Joe Biden this time. This time his message is, I am your retribution. He is treating his supporters as human shields and asking them to vote for him to shield him from the rule of law, which he promises to destroy if he's reelected. I don't know that there have been organized crime leaders who have articulated a message like that, but never a candidate for the American presidency. And I wonder if you think the rule of law survives that campaign.
The former president's comments, Nicole, have been chilling to America for many years now. And of course, he's escalated his attacks on the Constitution, the rule of law, and America's institutions of democracy and law in the past 3 or 4 weeks as he's been indicted in the several courts. And of course, continuing a pattern that he had actually begun the day that he assumed office in 2016, he has viciously attacked the federal judiciary and even the individual judges who will preside over his trials. That is unprecedented in American history. It's inexcusable, and it is a grave danger to America, and it's a disservice to the American people. Incidentally, it's a disservice to his own cause in the defense against the charges that he will now be tried on by the United States of America. Over the course of these years, Nicole, and I've said this repeatedly, the former president has viciously attacked America's democracy, the Constitution, and the rule of law. The former president, he dared and provoked Jack Smith to indict him for both the Mar-a-Lago classified documents, and finally, he succeeded in forcing Jack Smith to indict him also for January 6th, lest the former president succeed in making a mockery out of America, the Constitution, and the rule of law. The former president of the United States of America wanted to be indicted for these offenses on any given day from January 6, 2021 until the indictments were brought, he could have avoided and prevented prosecution. He did not want to. We now know that he wanted to be indicted so that he can run on the same platform that he's been talking about since January 6, 2021, namely that the election was stolen from him by Joe Biden and the country. I don't know who he's referring to, but it was stolen from him when in fact he lost that election fair and square in what was, we now know, perhaps the fairest election in American history.
You are making a constitutional argument, and I just want to read your tweet about the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment itself in Section 3 answers the question whether disqualification is anti-democratic, declaring that it is not. Rather, it is the conduct that gives rise to disqualification that is anti-democratic, per the command of the Constitution. I'm not in any position to debate the legal merits of this, but I want to ask you how this happens. I mean, do the states have to use this argument to keep him off the ballot? I mean, how does this, because it's clear that on the right, there is almost a pipeline of taking these arguments, bringing these cases, getting them all the way to the Supreme Court and changing policy. I wonder if you would be part of an effort to make that happen to protect democracy. Otherwise, how does this protect the country from him?
Nicole, our Constitution is written in, for the most part, in broad, open-ended, capacious language in which the restraints on our government are defined, and our rights and liberties as Americans are defined in broadest principle. On the other end of that continuum of language in our Constitution are much more specific provisions akin to statutes as opposed to constitutions, in which the Constitution defines, for instance, the qualifications for the presidency of the United States. One of those qualifications is that the president must be 35 years of age. The disqualification provision of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, and therefore the imposition of that qualification for the presidency, is stated in perhaps the clearest language possible in the Constitution, and it is unmistakably applicable to the former president and his role and activities on January 6th. So the question is not whether the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment applies to the former president. It unquestionably does. The questions that the Supreme Court must decide eventually are rather more technical constitutional questions. For instance, whether the clause is self-executing, and whether which particular officials are in a position to challenge the qualification of the former president. But in terms of the process, the process is quite clear. I believe to a certainty that there will be secretaries of states in several of the states who will decline to place the former president on the ballot, arguing that he is unqualified by virtue of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Whether that official or those officials qualify the president, former president, or they disqualify him, that decision will be immediately challenged in state or federal court by a person with standing to challenge it. It would certainly include the former president. And from that moment on, this will be a matter destined for the Supreme Court of the United States, and the Supreme Court will be obliged to decide this monumentally important case before the 2024 election.